Okay, today we're going to be learning Pesachim Daf Nun Bet. I want to just start by thanking everybody who came last night to the skills-based shiur about Seder, of the Seder, about sugyot relating to Lela Seder and starting to learn basic skills of Gemara. There were 300 women there. It was amazing. So thank you all for joining. Anyone who didn't join, it's never too late to join. You could still join. You can go on anyone who wants to join, who wants to listen on their own time can listen through the system. Again, you have to go register, and then through that, you will get all the materials. The materials will be up hopefully by midday today, Israel time. So all the recordings, right now, all the materials are up, but the recordings will be up later today. So thank you everyone for joining. And we're gonna get started with our daf for today. Today's daf is sponsored by Gabrielle Altman in memory of Rabbi Ruby Davis Zichrono Livracha, the same person as was dedicated yesterday. Yesterday, there was some typos in the text, so it's fixed up now. Beloved father of Debbie Raps, who was in his 7th cycle of Daf Yomi, and Rabbi Moshe Raps, Zichrono Livracha, beloved father of Azi Raps, who inspired thousands with a love of Torah and learning. I have a dedication for the same person from different people, different connections. Okay, we're going to start now from the bottom of Nun Aleph Amud Bet. I know you saw yesterday in the chat of the Zoom group, there was a whole question about Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galuyot, right? What we do, and it was exactly the sugya that comes up today. A little bit different than ours, and then you would expect it to appear, but we're going to talk about Rav Safra. Amalei Rav Safra le Rabbi Abba. It's a little bit unclear where Rav Safra is coming from. We're going to see, in fact, he appears later in the Gemara as going from Israel to Babylonia, and maybe he was coming from Israel, although Tosfot doesn't understand that this way. And Tosfot says something very interesting, but we'll see in a minute. He says, Kigon Anan, diyadina b'kviya diyarche, like us, who we know the calendar. Okay, what does it mean we know the calendar? So first of all, we need some background. How did the calendar work? Right? There was a certain point in history where they would check the new month based on witnesses. They would bring witnesses to the Sanhedrin. They would testify, did we see the new moon? If they accepted it, then they would declare that day Rosh Chodesh. If not, the next day, because every month is either in the Hebrew calendar 29 days or 30 days. So the night after the 29th, if witnesses came that the next day, then they would declare day 30 as day 1 of the month. If not, then day 31 would be the first day of the next month. So then at a certain point, they declared, you know what, we're going to come up with a calendar. And that's what we have nowadays. We don't do it that way, right? We have a set calendar. But in the times when they did it before that, they would send out messages. There were times when they did bonfires, and then they sent out messengers. And some of the messengers would also get to Bavel. And that's what Tosfot says we're talking about here. Tosfot says it can't be. If you look at the last Tosfot on the page, he says, V'lo b'sod ha'ibor kamar. When he says, we know the kviya diyarcha, okay, we haven't even gotten to his question. I'm first just explaining the first 3 words of what he says, or the first 5 words. Like us, we know the kviya diyarcha. What does it mean we know? So Tosfot says it doesn't mean that we know how the calendar should be in this. We have a 19-year cycle has leap years every few years. There's 7 leap years within every 19 years. He doesn't mean that because why not? Because everybody knew that. The Habnei Bavel b'kibi bor diyarcha. In other words, at that point, everybody already knew that. But what happened? They wanted to retain the old custom that they had done before, which was anyone in chutz la'aretz. Okay, but we're going to see. We always think it's anyone anywhere outside of Israel, but it's not necessarily true, we're going to see, because according to Tosfot, Rav Safra was not in Israel. He was coming from a city in Babylonia. Okay, he says, Shaya yodea matay nikba hachodesh. He knew when the month was because he was from a city where the messengers would get to. Okay, there were certain cities in Babylonia that the messengers would get there. You have to remember, the holidays generally, other than Shavuot, and Shavuot anyway is counted 49 days from, right, the 50th day from Pesach. So you don't even need the calendar for that. All the other holidays, Pesach, Sukkot, are in the middle of the month. So by that time, messengers were able to get to certain places in Babylonia. So he was from a city, apparently. Either he's saying I'm from Israel, or he's saying I'm from a city in Babylonia that never had 2 days of the holiday, because we always knew. So he says, people like me, I understand that if I go to a city in Babylonia where they keep 2 days of Yantif because they don't know, so I understand if I go there, I have to keep 2 days. If I go by Yishuv, Yishuv is a place, a settled, inhabited place. But what about if I go to a desert? Okay, this happened to me once. I was in the Far East. We were in a city called Hue in the middle of Vietnam. There was absolutely no Jews there, I can promise you. We were the only Jewish people there, no chance. So now that would be considered like a midbar. Be midbar mai, what if there's no people around, right? And no people, I assume, means no people keeping the holiday, because the issue is that if you don't keep the holiday in a place where there's a holiday, so it's like what they call pgi'ah b'chavod chag, right? The kedushat chag. There's kedushat chag there, and you're basically messing that up. You're saying, I don't care. So he says, but what if I'm in the midbar? So Amarle, Hachi Amar Rav Ami. So the answer he gets is, Rav Ami said, Yishuv asur b'midbar mutar. If you're in a settled area, it's forbidden. If you're in the desert, it's permitted. Okay, so Tosfot points out something very interesting. There's a bit of a question here, and I'm going to give you 4 different approaches to the answer. Why is this interesting? I'm not going to give you a shir halacha l'maaseh, what you should do if you go from place to place, because this is not a halacha shir. But what I am going to give you is some perspectives on where different opinions might come from. And really, they come from right here. So if you see here, what does he say? There's a bit of an issue here, because we saw yesterday that remember with the da'itara, he was eating it b'tzin'ah, right? There's, on the one hand, there's this issue of minhag hamakom. On the other hand, it seems like it's not just because of machloket. If you're not going to do machloket because you're going to be in your room behind closed doors, it shouldn't be an issue. But that's not what they say here. They don't use the terminology of tzin'ah for hesia. For hesia means public, tzin'ah means private. They use yishuv and midbar. Yishuv and midbar sounds like if you're in a settled area, it doesn't matter whether you're, the way the halachic terms say, chadrei chadarim, you're in an inner room where no one can see you. It doesn't make a difference, according to this. This seems to say, when it comes to 2 days of Yantif, it just matters, are you in the Yishuv or you're in the desert, right? The difference between when I was in Hawaii versus if I went to visit my parents in America, right? If I went to visit my parents in America and I was in their house and I was in my room behind closed doors, according to this, it sounds like, the way Tosfot reads it, you still can't do malacha. Why is that? So Tosfot says, why is there this distinction? When we talked yesterday about tzina, privately, it doesn't matter. And here, it seems that privacy is not a relevant issue. So he says, afilu b'tzina. Look at the first Tosfot on the page if you have a Gemara in front of you. V'yishuv lo avdinan afilu b'tzina, even privately. V'afilu da'ato lachzor. Remember Rav Ashi yesterday, he said, oh, Rabbi Bar Chana, why did he do it? Because he was planning to go back home. Right? Like if I go visit my parents, I'm planning to come back to Israel. Obviously, right? That would be a classic case of da'ato lachzor. According to Rav Ashi, you don't have to do chumrei makom in that case, right? You might have to worry about not doing it in front of other people, but you don't have to do it. But he says this is different. This issue of malacha is different, and you can question why he says this and the accuracy of what he's saying, or I don't know, the reality. Lo efshar lemalacha b'tzina k'mo shar dvarim. He basically says there must be a difference between Isra malacha, doing malacha on Yantif. That's not the same because there's no real tzina, which is interesting because you could say there is, right? I remember once being in my parents' house and it was tricky because if we, let's say, did something, somehow you're living in the same house, someone would know that you had done something. Like it's possible, right? It's very likely. Like let's say I blow dried my hair, right? So I got out of the shower, I went to my room, I blow dried my hair, and either someone would hear it or I would walk out and my hair all of a sudden would be dry. It would be known that I had done something. So there's this, what Tosfot claims is there's a distinction between, right, if you did like, you worked on, so the tricky part is, let's say you worked on Erev Pesach. So that if you did it b'tzina, it would be okay. So again, you have to question how he exactly distinguishes that kind of work wouldn't be noticeable. This kind of work would be noticeable. But what Tosfot's trying to say is there's clearly a difference here, and we have to come up with a reason as to why there's a difference. So that's one approach. Another approach is to say we can differentiate between the type of minhagim that we're talking about, like we did earlier. We said there's different minhagim. Minhag of Isur Yom Tov is a very serious one because second day Yantif, even though we know the calendar now, but really you're grappling with issues that if it really is Yantif today, then it's forbidden by Torah law to work. So that's different than not working on the morning of Erev Pesach, which nobody thinks is really ever forbidden. It's just a custom. So maybe you can distinguish between level of severity of custom. Okay, in a little bit in that direction, that's some Achronim say that. The Baal HaMaor says that we're specifically stringent on Yom Tov, Sheni, as opposed to other ones because that's a minhag. Let me ask you, I'll just ask you simply. Have you ever heard of people not working on Pesach in the morning? I mean, a lot of us don't, but it's not necessarily because we have a minhag about it. But have you ever heard of people keeping 2 days of Yantif? Of course, because that's something that what we say, okay, in the words of the Pashat B'Kol Hagolah. It's a minhag gadol that's spread entirely. When you talk about customs, all sorts of criteria that define what makes a custom a stronger custom. And that's why kitniot is a little bit hard to get over, because it had really, the sources talk about it had spread around all of Ashkenaz. So because once a minhag spreads, it's very difficult, or it's taken more seriously. So this is a much more serious minhag than the others. And that's why it's taken more seriously. So all three of those address the same question, which is, why do we seem to be more stringent with this one, that it's only going to be allowed in the midbar and not in tzina? Okay. Now, in private. However, what I want to point out is very interesting. If you look at Rashi, okay, I specifically chose Rashi for last, even though we often read Rashi first. Look at the first Rashi on the page. B'yishuv lo avidna, malacha b'yom tov sheni. You can't do malacha in the yishuv, in a settled place. Ho'il v'nagu bo isur, because people treated it as it was forbidden. Lo eshanel le'enehem et haminhag. He adds a very critical word. Le'enehem. I can't do it in front of them. He understands yishuv as public and bamidbar as private. So according to Rashi's interpretation, it sounds like as long as you're doing it in private, it's not a problem. So here you see how this Gemara, by choosing different wording, all of a sudden leads to, is this inherently different? Or is this really the same and it's just using different words to describe it? So there's you could see how you would come to a wide range. According to Rashi, then, if you're in New York and you come from Israel and you're there for the holiday, you can do anything you want, bitzina. Sounds like, again, Rashi not paskening, but again, I'm not giving you psak halacha here, but I'm showing you how the Gemara can lead to different interpretations. So I couldn't, resist by going into that a little bit, because it's a very interesting and relevant topic. Okay, now we're going to hear another story. Okay, by the way, I forgot to mention earlier in the week, but Shir and Chamutal this week on Daf Mishalahen talk all about minhag and the significance of minhag in general. Minhag, so related to the whole parak, are recommended listening for this week. Rav Natan bar Asya azami beirav lepupadita b'yom tov sheni shalatzeret. Now we have a case of Rav Natan bar Asya. Now again, the details of this are unclear. Was he coming from a place where they didn't keep Yom Tov Sheni and going to a place where they did? Or was it just the issue we're going to see right now is that he went from the house of Rav to Pumbedita. Now, what's the issue? He went beyond the Tchum Shabbat. Tchum Shabbat, we already learned, is not just Shabbat, it's also on Yom Tov. So he went beyond the Tchum. Now, you can't go beyond the Tchum on Shabbat or Yom Tov. But what's the issue? Well, the issue is, maybe he thought that it was allowed because when you walk, now remember, what does the Tchum mean? It means there's nothing settled. Remember, if you have houses outside the city, then that's considered part of the city and you're still allowed to walk there. So generally, when you walk 2,000 cubits outside the city, it's an area where nobody's living. That is like the midbar. So the question is this considered he did something where nobody really saw what he was doing because he was doing it in the yishuv? So maybe it was allowed. So again, it seems like he must have maybe come from a place where he didn't keep 2 days of Yantiv. Otherwise, it doesn't make as much sense. But in any case, he did this. Shamte Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef didn't like that he did this. Why? Because this isn't Sinna. What is Sinna? Private. Nobody knows about it. Now, when you get to Pumbedita and they say, oh, where'd you come from? And you say, oh, I came from the yeshiva of Rav. Everybody knows that that's outside the borders of the city. So they'll know that you went outside the Tchum. That's not something that nobody knows about. Even if it happens in the desert, still people are going to know about it. So, according to Rav Yosef, what did he do? He excommunicated him. That's pretty severe. Amarle Abaye says, why didn't you give him lashes? Okay, why did you choose to excommunicate and not give him lashes? We're going to have two versions of the story. Amarle, Adif Avdele, I did what was more harsh, because this I take very seriously. You see how seriously they took 2 days of Yantif. Said, I do the more harsh. How do I know that excommunication is really harsh? And here we're going to get to another very interesting thing that I want to bring up today, which is, he says, B'ma'arava in Eretz Yisrael, mimnu anegida debar beirav. When a Talmid Chacham did something wrong, they would decide, okay, are we going to punish or are we not? And if they would punish with lashes. Lo mimnu ashamta. But he didn't, they would never punish a Talmid Chacham with excommunication. Why is that? It's a very interesting thing. Because to punish a Talmid Chacham with excommunication is what we call a chilul Hashem, right? We make a big public declaration that a Talmid Chacham did something wrong. A Talmid Chacham is representative of God. then it looks, right, it doesn't look good. It's not respectful to do that to a Talmid Chacham. So what do we learn from this line? What we learn from this line is that excommunication is clearly more severe than lashes. And that's why this person got excommunication, because what he did was very severe. You see how seriously they took Yom Tov Sheni. Again, one could say maybe because they were worried people weren't going to take it seriously and therefore had to be very serious about it. So therefore he got excommunicated. The problem is that his name is Rav Natan Bar Asi. Sounds like he's a Talmid Chacham. He has the name Rav. In which case, if he said you can't excommunicate rabbis, how did he excommunicate him? Anyway, that might explain why there's a different version of this story. So according to the second version, Ika da Amre, Aleph Dala means Ika da Amre. Some people say, Nagde Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef gave him lashes. Amrle Abaye, Nisham Temar. Why didn't you excommunicate him? Now, why did Abaye suggest it, right? It's the reverse here. So why did Abaye suggest excommunication? The Rav Shmuel, the Amrei Travayu, both of them said, Minadim al Shnei Yamim Tovim Shel Galuyot. Right? They said, if somebody doesn't keep this, they get excommunicated. We make an example of it. Amarle, so what was Rav Yosef's answer? Hanimile inish alma hachatzur v'merabanenu. That's regular people. But when it comes to a Talmid Chacham, this guy was a Talmid Chacham. That makes more sense. He was a Talmid Chacham, did Tavale Avde. We give him the less severe punishment. And now this line really proves, how do we know that we give Talmidei Chachamim a lesser punishment, right? Last version, it was just proving that one is more severe than the other, right? Excommunication is more severe. Here it's proving why we specifically don't excommunicate. And that's because we do this for Talmidei Chachamim, v'lo mimnu ashamta, but we don't do it for excommunication. Okay, we won't ever excommunicate a Talmid Chacham. Now, this is very problematic in light of what goes on nowadays. We all know that there's lots of issues with sometimes Torah scholars or, seemingly Torah scholars that get involved in inappropriate behavior with children, with women, with all sorts. And there's always a debate. And you see this here. How do we treat Talmidei Chachamim? Right, exactly. I see Frida, you're asking, shouldn't they be held to a higher standard? So I want to read you in the Shulchan Aruch where he talks about this. He says, I'll tell you in a minute the source. It's Yoredea Shin Lamedalid. Okay, Seif Membet. There's a lot of Seifim there. So if you want to write it down to see, okay, it's Yoredea Shin Lamedalid Seif Membet. He says, Chacham zaken bechokma or av beitin. If you have a chacham who's wise, old doesn't mean old, it means wise bechokma and intelligence, or av beitin, some leader of the community, shesarach, that went, did something wrong. We don't ever excommunicate him. Okay, don't worry. Don't get nervous when you read this. Okay, make sure you listen to the second part. Don't stop the recording now. Unless he did like Yeravam ben Nevad. If you remember, that was when the Malchut split after Shlomo and Shlomo's son, and the Malchut split. And his friends. Okay, which again they did idol worship, other things. Aval, and they caused others to sin also. Aval k'shachata sh'ar chataot. Okay, but when they sin other things, malkino tobitzina, we do it privately. We don't let people know about it. We keep it, right, as you say, under the carpet. V'chein kol tamid chacham shenitchayev nidoy asur lebeitin likfot ulenedoto. Okay, if there was a tamid chacham that should have gotten excommunicated, like our story, the beitin can't likfot, jump up and quickly put him in excommunication bimheira, quickly. Okay. Don't quickly jump and say, oh, we're excommunicating. We kind of try to avoid it as best as we can because it's dangerous to start doing this kind of thing. Okay, that's the first part of what the Shulchan Aruch says, which seems pretty much based on our Gemara. However, listen to the second part, and this is in the same section. But I'm not right. Same sentence. Okay, that's actually still part of it. The Chasidei Chachamim would praise themselves that they would never excommunicate a Talmid Chacham. Okay, so even though they would give him lashes, but again, they would do that quietly. Here comes the interesting part. But then he says, V'isane shomane. Okay, sane usually means hated. Shomane, those who hear it. I'm not exactly sure what this phrase means, but if people despise this person, okay, Kigon, Shemitasek, now he's going to give his list of what is not included in that category. Now, if he crosses a line, basically, that can't be crossed. Okay, what is this line for them? It's not necessarily the same as for us, but this line is, okay, she. Kigon Shemitasek Sifrei Apikoros. Okay, they spend their time learning Sifrei Apikoros, right? things that are, I don't know exactly how you would define apikoros, but heresy, heretical stuff. V'shoteh b'minei zemer, and they drink in all sorts of music and, get involved in parties, I guess. Oh, and here's the big line. Shechaverav mitbaishim mimenu. People are embarrassed by this person. Okay, now that would definitely qualify in the category that we're discussing. Happens nowadays, probably happened then too, but people were less aware. V'shem shamayim mitchalel yado, and already it's a chilul Hashem what he's done. Then mishamtin alei, then you can actually excommunicate. So this is a very interesting issue that, again, two fascinating issues that come off of our daf today. Okay, let's move on. Kayotsebo. Now we're back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah had something that we weren't clear about, which was Kayotsebo molich perot shvi'it. It said, the second part of our Mishnah was, if you take perot shvi'it and you take them from a place where they no longer have vegetables in the field, and you go to a place where they do, or the reverse, right? So, chayav leva'er. Sounds like Tanakam is saying, minhag hamakom, right? Either which way, whether you came from, where you went to, you have to be stringent. And Rabbi Yehuda says, seva haveh lecha afata. Rabbi Yehuda seems to say, let's say you go to a place where they don't have any more vegetables in the fields, but in your location they do. So you say, hey, you have a problem with me eating my vegetables here? Go to my city and go take vegetables if you want, which means what? Rabbi Yehuda is being lenient, okay? So let's see what the Gemara says. So first of all, the first question the Gemara asks is, according to this, what happened to chumrei makom, right? Tanakama says chumrei makom, but Rabbi Yehuda doesn't seem to do that. So the Gemara asks, what did he ignore that halacha? That you have to go by the most stringent, whether you came from or whether you went to. So how could he be lenient? Amrav Shisha Bereda Rav Idi, Milta Achrita Kama Rabbi Yehuda. He says, oh, you must have misunderstood Rabbi Yehuda. He's not talking about a classic case of makom shekalu makom shelo kalu, like the Mishnah says. He's talking about a bit of a variation on that. The Hachi Kamar, and this is what he meant to say. Omi makom shelo kalu, lemakom shelo kalu. I left, okay, let's take Ranana and Yerushalayim. It's an easy example. I live in Ranana. So I left from Ranana. There were still fruits on the ground, okay, or produce, vegetables on the ground. I went, let's use our cucumber example. There were still cucumbers on the ground. I went lemakom shelo kalu. I went to Jerusalem. Also, there were still cucumbers on the ground. So far, both my place and the new place, there's cucumbers. But Shama, when I was in Jerusalem, I found out shekalu b'mkomo, that there's no longer cucumbers in Ranana anymore. At that point, Tanakama says, chayav leva'er. This is not really minhag hamakom, right? Something changed from when I left. So Tanakama says you have to get rid of it because right now in Ranana, there's no more cucumbers. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, seva haveh lecha afata. Now, bring from where? He says, no, right now you're in Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem there's still fruits. So from where you brought it to. In other words, you brought, since you left the Ranana and there were still cucumbers, and you got to Jerusalem, and now in Jerusalem there still are cucumbers. The fact that in Ranana there were no longer, that doesn't really matter anymore. Right now, here where you are, there's still vegetables, and when you left there were still vegetables, so you're okay. But there's a problem with this explanation. The Memra to Rabbi Yehuda lekula kamar. According to this, Rabbi Yehuda is being lenient. Okay, and this you could see in the chart that in each section I wrote, we're going to have 5 explanations of this Mishnah. We did the first one right now, 5 alternative explanations from the way we simply understood it to begin with, and both the way we originally thought it and the way Rav Shisha explained it, Rabbi Yehuda is mekel, he's lenient. But the Gemara doesn't like that. They say it can't be he's more lenient. Why? Rabbi Elazar said, Lo amar Rabbi Yehuda ela lechumra. Rabbi Yehuda said what he said to be stringent. He was more stringent than the rabbis. So we have a tradition in the name of Rabbi Elazar that Rabbi Yehuda is more stringent, which is why all the next 4, you can see from the second to last section in the chart, all the next 4 explanations have Rabbi Yehuda being stringent, and they change the rabbis. Instead of saying chayav leva'er, they're going to have to say eino chayav leva'er. You don't have to get rid of them. You have to switch it. So first they're going to switch Rav Shisha and basically say that Rav Shisha goes the reverse. Eino chayav leva'er. Right? The Tanakama says you don't have to get rid of them. They're the ones who are lenient. And Rabbi Yehuda Omer, seva haveh lecha afata. Now, where are you going to bring it from now? If Rabbi Yehuda is being stringent, he's going to say, oh, you're in Jerusalem now, but go back to Ranana. Can you bring from Ranana? Right? Seva haveh lecha afata mehecha da'itinu. Go bring, they're going to say to him in Jerusalem, go bring produce from where you came from, Ranana, and guess what? Ha kalulahu. there's nothing left there. And therefore, you have to get rid of your stuff now. So seva v'elecha afata is kind of rhetorical, right? It doesn't mean go get and there's actually there. No, it's the opposite. Go get it. Oh, you're not going to find any, so you're stuck. So Rabbi Yehuda is stringent here. Okay, but according to this, they would both agree that if you came from Ranana and there were no fruits on the ground and you got to Jerusalem and there were, you'd have to be stringent. And the reverse also, you'd have to be stringent because of Chumrei Makom. This is only because originally both places still had produce on the ground. And then just something changed, and it changed in the place you came from, and that's why there's this debate. Next answer. Abaye Amal, he doesn't say why he doesn't accept this, but he explains his own. Okay, you'll see if you look in the chart, there's a difficulty with number one, right, Rav Shisha, and then there's going to be a difficulty with Abaye. All the others are just alternate explanations without having brought a difficulty on somebody else. Abaye Amar, L'olam kedigatani. Really, we can say it the way we read it originally. V'hachi kamar. Omi makom shelo kalu, lemakom shekalu, b'chziran limkoman. He says, this is what we meant to say. It's, you went to a place shelo kalu. I went from Ranana, there were cucumbers on the ground. I went to a place shekalu. In other words, that's what he means. Keep it the same. He doesn't keep everything the same because he still thinks Tanakama is stringent and says, ain't no chayav. I'm sorry, Tanakama is lenient and says you don't have to get rid of them. But what he says is the case is not that I went from Ranana to Jerusalem and there were fruits on the ground in both places. No, it's that I went, right? Fruits, I just mean produce, not fruits like on a tree. But he says it's that I went, although it would be true for fruits also, actually. But he says it's where I left Ranana. There was still produce on the ground. I went to Jerusalem, the Makom Shekalu. They no longer had. But I didn't eat them in Jerusalem. What did I do then? I went back to Ranana. Okay, right? You ever go like on an airplane and you bring stuff with you? You bring food for the way and then you end up not eating it and it comes back home with you, right? I always end up with this, like I bring all the snack food for my kids and then I come back to Israel with the same snack food. It was still in my bag. So that's a good example, right? I left and I came back and I didn't eat it there. So when I get back to Ranana, Adayin lo kalu, still they're on the ground. Okay, if it were really fruits, I'd have a problem because let's say I go, you can't bring them into a country, forget about that. But let's say it was something that I could bring it. So anyway, I bring them back and in Ranana, there's still produce on the ground. So now, according to Tanakama, eno chayav lava'er, because I am eating them in Ranana, I'm in Ranana, it should be fine. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, seva ve'elecha afata mehecha da'itinu, v'hakalu lehu. Go bring them from where you brought them to. In other words, you can't ignore the fact, Rabbi Yehuda says, that you went into a different place. You brought them into Jerusalem. They went in the airspace of Jerusalem. That means they now have a law like Jerusalem, and you have to, and in Jerusalem, there were no more cucumbers on the ground, so you have to get rid of those cucumbers. Maskefla Rav Ashi says, that's a crazy explanation. He says like this, the Rabbi Yehuda, Atu agav dechamar kaltinu, if something goes on the back of a donkey, it gets absorbed, it gets kind of taken in by the city. The fact that I took my stuff to America and I brought it back and it was still in my bag, does it have anything American about it? No. So why in this case, if I brought my fruits to Jerusalem and I brought them back, that I should say that because in Jerusalem, there were no more fruits on the ground anymore. Therefore, I now have to get rid of them? That doesn't make any sense. So Elam Rav Ashi takes a different approach. And Rav Ashi and Ravina, these next two answers are going to be each one saying a different machloka Tanaim, that the debate between them is like a debate that other Tanaim have. And then the connection, I'll already put it out there. There's a bunch of different explanations about how you connect them. I'll kind of explain it in one way, but know that there's different explanations. So El Amarav Ashi beplugta dahane tonight. They really argue about this issue that these Tanaim are debating. Ditna. Hakovesh shlosha kfashim bechavit echad. Let's say I pickle 3 vegetables. I take cucumbers, cabbage, and carrots, and I pickle them together. Now, they're all in one jar. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, ochlim al harishon. We go by the first, meaning as soon as the first one is no longer in the fields, then these are all considered one unit, and therefore we have to get rid of all of them. Rabbi Yoshua Omer, afal acharon. No, you can go by the last one. If it's cucumbers, carrots, and cabbage, if there's still cabbage, then all of these are okay. Okay, we wait till there's no more cabbage. Okay, because we treat it as one, but to be lenient, right? One goes stringent, one goes lenient. Rabban Gamliel Omer, kol shekala mino min hasadeh yivaer mimenu min hachavit. If you get rid of what's in the field, right? In other words, it all goes by that vegetable. We're going to see it in a very, right? Cucumbers are cucumbers, cabbage is cabbage, carrots are carrots. We go by each one, even though they're together in one jar, being pickled together, that really doesn't matter. I assume they're using the example of pickled because things get the flavor of other things. So now, and then they say halacha kidvarav. This isn't so relevant for our purposes, so we pass on like Rabban Gamliel. How does this relate to us? So you could explain it. Rabbeinu Hananel explains it, and actually I did this different in the chart, I think, but Rabbeinu Hananel explains it more. And I right before class I realized this, and I think I would have changed it in the chart. Rabbeinu Hananel says basically, take the first two opinions. One is stringent and one is lenient, right? One says as long as one of them is gone in the fields, you have to be stringent. That's like the rabbis who say chayav leva'er. Doesn't matter, as long as there's no produce in one of the places, we have to be stringent. Whereas Rabbi Yoshua is more lenient. He takes the opposite approach. As long as there's still are vegetables in one of the types, which would then apply to our case, even in one of the cities, you can be lenient. Okay, so it's a matter of leniency versus stringency. That's how Rabbeinu Hananel explains this. Ravina Amar bepluta dahane tonight. He says it's a different machloket tanaim. Ditznan ochlim b'tmarim ad sheyachleha acharon shebetzoar. Tzoar was known as the city of dates. So when it comes to eating dates, you judge it based on the city, not your own tree, not your own city, but the city of Tzoar, which was known as the city of Tmarim. But the way they're going to understand this, again, there's different ways of explaining it. They mean, though, that there's absolutely no dates left in Tzoar, even on the ground. That's when, because remember, it's for the animals to eat. When there's no more for the animals to eat, so if they're on the ground, the animals could still eat it. Shimon Gamliel omer, ochlin al sheben akifin ve'ein ochlin al gabe al sheben hashitzin. What does this mean? If you have a palm tree, so there's branches and it could fall in between the branches and kind of be sitting on the branches. I have this with trees in my backyard where, something falls and it leans on the branches. Then it's accessible to the animals. But if it falls down all the way to the bottom where there's prickly thorns there, once there are thorns, then already we're going to say the animals aren't going to go there because they're not going to go where there's prickly thorns. So therefore, right, they'll get pricked. They're not going to eat from there. That's as if there's nothing available. Even though there are, right, the first opinion would say there still are fruits out there. It doesn't make a difference. This opinion says no, once there aren't any. So now, how does this relate to our machloket? Again, if you say there's somewhere there's fruits, right, it doesn't matter how accessible they are. But if theoretically there are fruits, that's the first opinion. That's going to be like Rabbi Yehuda, who said, the rabbis who said, we're going to be lenient about this. As long as there's fruits in one of the places, it's okay. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you're going to have to be stringent. And he's more similar to the second opinion, which is if there's thorns and it's not so accessible, or it's in another town, or one of the towns doesn't have, then we're going to be stringent about it. So again, the exact connection is not a clear-cut connection, but they're somewhat connected in terms of their concept. Now we're going to see a few more brighter about this idea of bi'ur perot. Okay, we're just going more in depth into this idea about, again, we're talking, just to remind you, the Shemitah year, the 7th year, the sabbatical year, when you can't work the land, which is going to be next year, you can't work the land. So in that case, you're allowed to bring in items that grow in your house, but you can't, once there's no longer food in the fields, then you have to get rid of them in your house. Now, there's going to be a debate about how exactly we determine there's no more fruits in your field, in your city's field, in your town's field, in your area. How are we going to determine this? So, Tnan Hatam, there's a Mishnah there that says, Shalosh aratzot libiur. There's 3 areas for biur. Yehuda, ve'ever hayarden, and the Galil. Right? These are areas in Israel. So, right, Judea, the other side of the Jordan, and the Galil. V'shalosh aratzot b'chol achat ve'echad. And there's 3 sections within each one. V'lama amru shalosh aratzot libiur. What does it mean? It goes by your area. Okay, we assume that within your region, okay, that's how we're going to determine biur. So if you don't have in your field, but someone else does, you're fine. Where do we get this from? The pasuk says, this is where we learn this whole halacha from. Ula behemtecha, for your animals, those are the animals domesticated that live with you. Ula chaya, and your wild animals. Asher ba'artsecha, that are in your land, meaning it has to be available not only to your animals, but to the local ones that wander around. So think about it, right? Kol zman shachaya ochelet min hasadeh, hechel be'masha b'bayit. As long as the animals are eating in the fields, your animals that are in your house, your domesticated animals, can still eat, and obviously you. But kalal chaya asher b'sadeh, but when the wild animals can no longer have anything to eat, kalei lebem tachamei habayit. Now, where do the wild animals eat? They don't just eat in your field, right? They eat in the whole area. They wander around. Ugemiri de'en chaya shebiyudah gdela perot shebegalil. In other words, they wander around within areas, but they don't really cross the boundary. I mean, maybe the ones who live right on the border, but generally you won't have an animal from Judea that's going to end up in the Galilee. Okay, it's just not likely going to happen, and therefore they split up the areas by region. Tano Rabbanan, another Braita. Perot sheyatzu, a different issue about biur. Perot sheyatzu me'eretz Yisrael lechutz ha'aretz. Let's say I had fruits in Israel. This is good, right? I went abroad and I brought them with me. And when I left, they were still in the fields, but when I got there, they were no longer. According to Tanakama, I don't have to destroy them in Israel. I can destroy them wherever I am. You have to bring them back to Israel and destroy them in Israel. Because it says, right, that's in your land. So the Gemara now says, and now we see why they brought this. It's not just because it's some random halacha about biur, but they say, ha'afikte, we already took ba'artzecha to teach you about these three lands and the three areas. So how can you say we're going to learn something else from ba'artzecha, that you have to do biur in your land? So they say, this is our classic example. When we say you can't learn two things from one verse, well, you can, depending on how it's worded. Karebe ba'aretz ba'artzecha. It could have just said in the land. It said in your land. From there, we can learn two things. Inami, alternatively, it says asher me'artzecha. That is from your land. So we can learn that is for one thing, and be'artzecha, in your land, a second thing. Now we're going to have a good story. Rav Safra nafik me'eretz Yisrael l'chutz la'aretz. I told you that there's going to be a story of Rav Safra leaving Israel and going to Babylonia. Hava bahade garba dechamra d'shviit. He had a barrel of wine from the Shemitah year. Lavu bahade, they were with him, was walking with him in his trip, Rav Huna bar Rav Ika Rav Kahana, these two rabbis. Amar lehu, he said to them, have anyone learned from Rabbi Avau? He must have been the rabbi. Halakha Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar lo. Is the halacha like Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar? Do I have to go back to Israel to get rid of this wine? Amar le Rav Kahana, hachi amar Rabbi Avau. Rav Kahana said to him, yes, I learned from Rabbi Avau the following. Halakha Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. You have to go back to Israel. Amar le Rav Huna bar Rav Ika. Rav Huna pipes in and says, wait, hachi amar Rabbi Avau. I learned from Rabbi Avau. We don't hold like him. You don't have to go back home. Okay, now if you were Rav Safra, what would you do, right? Pain in the neck to go back to Israel, especially, in those days. It wasn't so easy. Just hop on a plane. Even now, it's really not so easy either. But anyway, it says, so Amar Rav Safra, Nikota klala de Rav Huna b'yadech. I now have two people. One is telling me Rabbi Avau said I have to go back. One is telling me Rabbi Avau said I don't have to go back. I'm going to go with the one who says Rabbi Avau says I don't have to go back. And why? Why? Because he's known Rav Huna bar Rav Ika. He's known that he's very careful about saying things properly from his rabbi. Obviously, one of them is misquoting his rabbi, right? So he's known that he takes particular care with how he passes down things from his rabbi. Like Rechava de Pumpadita, we actually learned this before. To Amar Rechava Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Harabayit Stav Kafulaya. Remember, it had these two rows of colonnades. Stav Lifnim Mistav. One was inner, one was outer, and he called it Stav, right? And not Itztiba. Normally we call it an Itztiba, but he used the language not of the Mishnah, but the language he learned from his rabbi. From there we see he was very careful about the language his rabbi used. Therefore, he's saying Rav Huna bar Rav Ika is in the same category as Rechava. When Rav Yosef heard this story, he said, Kari ale Rav Yosef, he saw right through him, and he said, Ami be'etzo yish'al maklo yagidlo. He quotes this verse. Maklo yagidlo is his stick, but he takes the word maklo and he says, Kol hamekelo magidlo. He uses it as an insult, and he said, you're just trying to be lenient. And you're going to accept the words of, right, the one yagidlo, you'll accept whoever told you from the one who's lenient. In other words, you clearly chose Rav Huna because you didn't want to go back, okay? And that's not appropriate, right? That's not the way we do things. So Rav Yosef was very unhappy with what he did. It's unclear whether that was really his motivation or not, but he certainly doesn't bring a proof how we know that Rav Huna bar Rav Ika was the one who, was also careful with his words. We don't have any proof of that. We have it by Rechava, but we don't have it by Rav Huna. So anyway, it's an interesting story. Next story, Rabbi Ilah, Katz Kafanyata de Shvi'it. He was cutting wood. He wanted wood for burning probably. He cut wood from a tree in the Shemitah year that had little teeny dates on it. Okay, it was from a palm tree. It had dates that weren't ripe at all. So, how could he have done this? Don't we know? You can pick things on the Shemitah year for purposes of eating. But not if they're going to go in the garbage. These dates you're going to throw out in the garbage. So how could he possibly have done that? Right? It's true he wasn't picking them for the fruit. That's all. That's the problem. How did he pick this tree that had little teeny dates on it? They hadn't ripened. That's destroying Shemitah fruit. The chitema, we're going to suggest something that they're going to reject, but in the end, we're going to actually use it as our answer. If you want to say, Hane mile, this is only, maybe it's only you can't destroy Shemitah produce. What does produce mean? When it's already a fruit. This, right, this teeny little date is not considered a fruit yet. There's no problem. But you can't say that because Hamar Rav Nachman Amar Rabba Ravua. Rav Nachman said in the name of Rabba Ravua, Hane matchale de orla asire. If you have an orla tree and you have, what happens is on the dates, the way they grow, there's a little, like the dates get enveloped by something while they're still ripening, which falls off once they ripen. It's not fruit, but because it's what we call, I'll read it inside. Okay, these matchale orla is this kind of thing that envelops the fruit while it's growing, of orla are forbidden. You also can't benefit from them. Ho'il v'nasu shomer lepere, because they're protecting the fruit. Something that protects the fruit has the same law as the fruit itself. Now notice what he's saying. When is this covering on it? Only when it's not ripe. So that means, and yet he's calling it a fruit. V'shomer lepere ematava. When is it protecting the fruit? Bikufre, when they're very little and not ripened yet. And kakari lepere, and he calls it fruit. Right? And he even gives the law of fruits to something covering it, which isn't even a fruit. So how can you say that it's not considered a fruit before it ripens? So the answer is, don't question us from Rav Nachman, because Rav Nachman da Amar ka Rabbi Yossi. He held like Rabbi Yossi, who has a stringent position about this. Ditznan, as it says in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi Omer, smadar asor mipnei shu peri. Rabbi Yossi says that the smadar is forbidden because it's a fruit. The smadar is the little bud. That's forbidden when it's teeny because it's a fruit. But Rabbanan, pligi Rabbanan alei, but the rabbis disagree. So we basically simply say, Rabbi Eli, who cut this tree and wasn't worried about destroying the fruits because he viewed, like the rabbis, that fruit, before it ripens, is not considered fruit. And therefore, there's no halachot of Shnata Shemitah, right? The whole issue that you can't destroy them. Whereas Rav Nachman, held by Rabbi Yossi, that it is considered fruit. And that's why he said when it comes to orla, whatever's protecting it is going to have the same law as fruit. We're going to stop here for today because the question they're going to ask now leads all the way into the next page. So we'll finish here for today and pick up tomorrow. Have a good day, everyone.